Hey guys, so today we're going to talk about Darwin's theory of evolution and how species have changed over long periods of time and how we all have evolved from one common ancestor. So we'll go over Charles Darwin, how he came up with this theory, and some other theory that was initially proposed about evolution as well. So Charles Darwin was an English scientist, and he basically traveled around the world with a English naval ship that was meant to go and basically map out and collect charters of the entire world. So Darwin attended this voyage and accompanied them on the Beagle, and he collected a bunch of plants and animals along the way. And what he learned was drastically more impactful than what the Navy had found. He figured out this groundbreaking theory of evolution. And how he did that was he learned that most species in the Galapagos occurred nowhere else in the world, but many of them resembled species that he had seen in South America. He also noticed that species on the island were related to each other, but had adapted different lifestyles. For example, the finches that he saw, and many of you probably remember Darwin's finches. That's the most associated animal with him. We'll be talking about the finches and how he noticed that they evolved. So here's a map showing you Darwin's voyage. You can see here's a map just kind of showing you his voyage. You can see that he left England and traveled down to South America, where they bounced around along the eastern coast. And then after traveling through Cape Horn, he traveled up the west coast of South America. But you can see here the highlighted region of the Galapagos Islands off the west coast of South America. That's where Darwin found the most significant research that he had collected. So they continued on through New Zealand, Australia, some islands in the southwest Pacific, and even Africa at the Cape of Good Hope. So this journey, I think, took over a year in order to circumnavigate the entire globe. But again, the research that Darwin gathered was invaluable. Here's an image of some of the finches that Darwin saw on the Galapagos Islands. And if you notice, all of these finches, although they look kind of similar, they all have different shaped beaks. And what Darwin noticed was that depending on the food sources and where these finches lived, their beaks were best suited for those food sources and those environments that they lived in. So it led Darwin to question, how did all of these different types of finches emerge? And why do they all look so similar, yet also have beaks that are shaped perfectly to fit their environment? What Darwin proposed was that after looking at these finches, and you can see here's a breakdown, and don't worry guys, you don't need to memorize any of this stuff. But what he realized was that all of these finches had come from one common ancestor that had likely been blown to the island in a storm. And once being on the island, the birds were trapped, and as they started to inhabit different areas of the island, over long periods of time, and one of the big misconceptions about evolution is that organisms can evolve. Organisms can't evolve, but populations can over long periods of time. And what Darwin believed was that this one single group of birds had evolved into all of these different species of birds, depending on where they lived and what they ate. So the finches that lived on the ground were able to eat seeds that they found, and they would need thick, strong beaks in order to crack those seeds. While finches that lived on cactuses would need longer, sleeker beaks in order to pick the flowers while avoiding spines that were on the cactuses. Similar beaks could be seen on insect eaters because, again, they needed precision to grab their insects while also staying away from them. While bud-eating finches might need wider beaks in order to eat these large buds. So, again, depending on what these finches ate and where they lived was eventually going to kind of determine what they looked like in the future. Here's a really interesting chart, and it just kind of shows you the time periods of when all of these discoveries were being made. When you think about history class, learning about the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the U.S. Civil War, you can kind of see what was going on in the world when these discoveries were made. And if you look at when Darwin was proposing evolution, it was right smack dab in the middle of the 1800s. If you compare that with Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, which you guys did on an assignment earlier this week, you'll notice that his proposition or his theory of evolution was made a little bit before that. So Darwin kind of built upon his idea. But one of the things to look at is right above Darwin is Gregor Mendel. And we just learned about Mendel and through learning about genetics, and they kind of discovered this stuff around the same time. And it's so interesting because Genetics is such a key part of Darwin's theory of evolution. However, Darwin didn't even know about genetics at the time because it was yet to be discovered. So we're just going to quickly introduce some scientists that kind of contributed to Darwin's thinking of this theory of evolution. The first is Carlos Linnaeus. Carlos Linnaeus was the founder of taxonomy, and taxonomy is a way of classifying organisms. He introduced a naming system called binomial nomenclature. For example, our scientific name is Homo sapiens. The first word, homo, means the genus, and we share a genus with other closely related organisms, while sapiens refers to our species names. He grouped these similar species into hierarchical categories based on common characteristics, and his groupings, though, implied no evolutionary kinship. And we'll talk more about this later when we talk about classification. Next were a couple of geologists that helped to mold Darwin's thinking, and the first was by the name of James Hutton. James Hutton founded this theory of gradualism that explained that features and changes in the physical world are a cumulative product of slow but continuous geological processes that occur over long periods of time. Charles Lyell was another geologist, and he proposed uniformitarianism, which basically said that these continuous geological processes are still occurring the same today as they did in the past, and continually changing the landscape of Earth. The take-home message that Darwin took were two really important things from this. The first was that Earth is really, really old. In fact, Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. The second is that slow and subtle processes that occur over long periods of time can actually result in huge changes. So Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology taught Darwin that the Earth's crust has been changing over time and hinted at the concept that events like erosion can accumulate to large-scale changes over time. Similarly, Darwin had found fossils from South America that gave evidence for extinct relatives of living organisms. Now we're going to talk about later some evidence that we have that evolution is in fact real, but while we're mentioning fossils, we'll kind of show you guys some pictures here. Fossils can be such a great way of comparing organisms with the past to the organisms that we have here today. And this is the way that Darwin was able to prove that the organisms that are alive today are similar to those that had gone extinct before us. Here are a couple different ways that things are fossilized. You can see here petrified wood in the middle up top. In the middle on the bottom. Fossils can also be of plants, which you can see here. And the way fossils work, we'll explain on the next slide. But the last one I want to go over is amber, which is in the bottom left corner. You can see here that was in Jurassic Park, if you remember, which, again, fictional movie, but some real science behind it. There are organisms that are preserved, such as tiny insects, in the hardening sap of trees. And that amber is able to be preserved for sometimes millions of years. This is kind of a quick thing on how fossils form. So basically, if an organism dies and ends up in a river, for example, well, sediment and layers of dirt are going to collect over that organism. And over time, as more and more dirt adds up and pressure builds, there are fossils that are imprints of what these organisms used to look like are basically etched in the dirt. And you can see here that depending on how deep these organisms are and what type of rock they're in, we can determine how old or what time period these organisms were alive in. Here's an example of some trilobite fossils seen here, and these organisms are millions of years old and came from a time when most of life originated in the water. Just quickly show you how the landscape can change, and these small minor changes can change gradually and have big impacts, is with the Grand Canyon. If we look, the Colorado River had eroded the landscape, and over time, now that the river is gone, we're left with this vast canyon. And again, just the flow of the river, these wore away small rocks and dirt along the walls and eventually etched this massive canyon into the landscape. So we'll briefly talk about Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's theory of evolution, because Darwin did use some of it, or it did help him kind of base his theory of evolution. So his was different and a little bit wrong for two reasons. The first part of his theory stated that there was use and disuse. Basically, the more you used a certain part of your body, it became larger and stronger. And those that you didn't use would deteriorate over time and wear down. He also believed that there was inheritance of these acquired characteristics. So basically, if I had used my right arm my entire life and I became very strong in my right arm because I'm using it all the time, well then when I had offspring, I would pass down that trait to the next generation. And Lamarck's theory was based on observations of fossils. However, it gave no mechanism for evolution. This, however, set the stage for Darwin. Now, one of the things I want to make sure that you guys know is why Jean-Baptiste Lamarck was wrong. And here's a picture of a very iconic dog, a Doberman Pinscher. Now, you might recognize it for its coat color, but really the thing that stands out about this dog is its pointed ears. Now, when we look at the puppy of the Doberman Pinscher, you might notice that they don't have pointy ears. Well, that's not because at some point they grow into their ears, but instead it's because when people buy Doberman Pinschers, they prefer them to look a certain way. They like those pointy ears because they're kind of intimidating to look at. And so what they do is they bring their dogs to have their ears surgically changed. They basically cut their ears, they pull them really tight back on their head, and they actually sew them to the side of their head. And if that didn't happen, take a look at what an adult Doberman Pinscher would look like. You can see here that adult Doberman Pinscher dogs, they don't have pointy ears. And no matter how many times you pin the ears back on these dogs, their puppies will always have floppy ears. And this is where Lamarck was wrong. According to Lamarck's theory, their offspring should have these pointy ears, but that's not how genetics works. We can change what our physical appearance looks like, but our genetics are still our genetics, and that DNA of floppy genes are going to be passed down to the next generation. Here's just kind of a chart showing you what Lamarck thought. He thought that although organisms did change over time, and he did recognize that, he thought that they just changed but remained the same species and just had small details change about them over time. He also acknowledged that some organisms became extinct, for example the T-Rex, and that's due to the fossils that he found. The main difference between Lamarck's theory and Darwin's theory is that Lamarck believed that all species have independent origin and that they are not related to each other. However, he did acknowledge they do evolve over time. Now we'll get to Darwin, and Darwin was very hesitant when he first came up with this theory of evolution, and part of his reasoning was because it went against the church, and at the time, especially in England, the church was a very big part of the government, and he knew that there would be social and personal consequences for going against the church's theories in his findings. After thinking about it for a long time, though, Darwin finally decided to publish his book after he heard that another scientist by the name of Alfred Wallace had a similar idea, and he was afraid of losing credit for all of his hard work. So in 1859, Darwin published On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. In the same year, Alfred Wallace also published his ideas on natural selection. And if you think about it, you probably have never heard of him before, but hopefully you've heard of Charles Darwin. So again, makes sense why he published his work. So On the Origin of Species is a very, very long book, but really we're going to boil it down to just 5 bullet points on natural selection and what that really means. So Darwin believed and he observed that populations have variations. If you look around the classroom or a population, you're going to notice that everybody has different features, right? Different traits. Now some of these variations are favorable compared to others. So if we're thinking about, for example, organisms that live in the wild, some of these variations are going to help these organisms survive, give them an advantage over others. More of these offspring are produced than can survive is the third point. And so there's always competition between these organisms to see which ones will survive and which will not. Now what Darwin knew was that those that survive, they must have some sort of favorable traits that give them an advantage over the others. And these favorable traits, these organisms that survived, they will be the ones that pass down their traits to the next generation. So in future generations, he knew that these favorable traits would be seen more. Over long periods of time, and guys, we're talking thousands, millions of years, he knew that these organisms could evolve into different organisms, having these more favorable traits.